I talk a decent amount in my videos about how I grew up because that's my personal experiences. I grew up in poverty, housing insecurity, never in the school for more than 2 years. You know, a lot of abuse and domestic violence, a lot of struggles, a lot of struggles when I was growing up, and I had to like spend years of my adulthood playing catch up and having a delay on being able to get to a more functional way of life by trying to overcome a lot of the stuff that unfortunately I just had to overcome. And I talk about that quite a bit, but something that's more rare but that I definitely experienced, that I think might be helpful for anyone who watches my videos to know, is I did actually, despite my extreme poverty, spend time around multimillionaires. Um, which sounds weird, but it is true. When I was, say, around like 8 or 9, maybe 10, my father started working for a multimillionaire. And my father very quickly, because he was skilled at what he did, he had been doing it since he was 10 years old. He was a bricklayer. He had been laying bricks since he was 10. He quickly rose up the ranks through the foreman and everything on job sites and stuff until he was third highest in the company. And so he spent a lot of time around this multimillionaire. And he didn't make a ton of money himself, but because he spent time around him and they became kind of friendly with each other, us kids got brought around to the multimillionaire's mansion. And let me tell you, it was a mansion. Like, it was it was massive. And my father never stopped working for that guy. So on and off, whenever I was living with my father, which was part of the time in a year, we would sometimes end up over at his property or end up going out to something with them. And so I was around this very wealthy person, like over 100 mil wealthy person. And this was during like the 90s, you know, like this was over 100 mil during the 90s. Go look at how much, you know, that would be in today's money. Okay. And there were even a couple of points when he had me work for them. So like, they had stables with horses and everything. And so I would go like muck out the horse stables or, you know, brush the horses and things like that. I liked the horses, and they had a cute little foal one year, and oh my gosh, that foal was amazing. Anyway, and I got to be around these horses because I was willing to go clean horse poo, and he would, you know, pay me to do that. Or like, there was another person that my father knew through the multimillionaire, and she was a very kind woman, and she paid me one summer to come and do her garden, and I was like, I'm gonna do a good job so that maybe she hires me again. That was my mentality. Whenever I was around these really wealthy people, I was always like, I need to do as good a job as possible so they'll hire me again. That was my thing. So I weeded it to where literally all of the dirt in the entire garden was black. Like I literally by hand pulled up all of the weeds and the turf because it was completely overgrown, and created rows and plant. She came out there and she was in shock. And she was partially in shock because she was like, wow, this is taking you a long time. This is taking you way longer than I thought it was going to, you know. And on the other hand, she was like, I did not expect this quality of work. So she paid me $60 an hour, and it took me like 7 hours, something like that. So that day I felt, whoa, I did you know, like I was super happy about it. So when I did the horse stables, I think I got $10 an hour for doing that. So I want to make really clear, just because they were wealthy did not mean that they were just throwing all their money away. But they did throw it away on specific things. Like, and I got to be around that. It was very strange. No one ever taught me about investing money. I never understood it, but I knew these rich people did. And because I knew the rich people did, I thought it was something that only rich people did. I thought retirement accounts. My father doesn't have a retirement account. The only thing he has is his union pension. So obviously retirement accounts are for rich people. And I thought saving, now that's something I can do even if I'm poor. But I had no idea that even a poor person can invest. And I want to make really clear, even a poor person can invest. You can start investing with $1. There is no too small of an amount of money to start getting interest on. Okay? Anyway, that was a side note. I also, when I started doing my 2-year associate degree, I had to intern, and I interned at a place that was worth multi-millions. And so I was around a decent chunk of wealthy people. And so I got to observe them as an 18, 19, 20-ish year old. I got to observe the habits of these wealthy people. And again, I thought their habits were things that I couldn't do because I was poor. And I wish anyone would have told me, yeah, you can do this too. I really wish that. We had one single class on finances when I was in college, and that was it. Like, nothing else. And it was more about budgeting, which I was already good at. And so this really sucks. I really wish I would have understood anything about investing. But I sometimes on my videos and stuff, I speak about wealthy people, and I want to go ahead and explain, I guess. I've observed them for a lot of my life. And I want to go ahead and say there are some positive and some negative things about wealthy people that I've encountered in my own personal experiences that have helped to shape some of the ways that I view wealthy people now. And I do try to balance that with statistics and with, actual research on the matter. But the majority of the research on the matter says the same things that my experiences did. When I was growing up, the multimillionaires knew how poor we were. At one point, my father lived in one of their barns on one of their properties because he could not afford to live anywhere else. They never once were like, here, have some money, or here, let me buy you a house. Here, I'll pay your bills this month. Never once. Not once. In my experience, the most generous that a wealthy person has ever been toward me was if I was doing a job for them. They would pay me more than what was average for that time, which I appreciated. Believe me, I appreciated that. Especially if I was doing a good job. If I was doing a good job, they would be like pretty happy to do that. The only other times that they were generous was one time a wealthy person, they actually bought me my first button-up shirt, like dress-up shirt, to like go to interviews with and stuff, and I genuinely appreciated that. And they tried to teach me about like looking a little less disheveled. It meant a lot to me, but it cost them next to nothing. It wasn't even as much as they spent on like cosmetics in a week. In my personal experience, they were super proud to be generous if it was in public, if someone could see it. But if it was someone who was personally near them or someone they knew or something like that, they weren't interested in generosity. Now, that is not 100% of multimillionaires, and I have never been around multi-billionaires. Allow me to be really clear. This is people who had $1 million or more. But again, this is up into the hundreds of millions that I have been around in my life. And in my personal experience, all of the ones that I've encountered were this way. Now, I am very aware that there has to be ones that are not like that. A, because of statistics and research, and B, every once in a while you see a news article about someone who is wealthy who actually isn't that way. So it is absolutely possible, for sure, but the majority of the time, statistically, it's not the case. If you make friends with someone who's super like multimillionaire or whatever, don't expect them to get all generous toward you. That's a misconception that I've seen before from poor people. They're just like, oh, I need a sugar daddy, or oh, I need to make best friends with Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos or whatever. If I was their best friend, then I'd have it made. And I want to dispel that delusion. If you're one of the people who has that impression, that's not a normally high odds of happening circumstance. Another thing is, a lot of the wealthy people that I've been around, they talk about money a lot and they work a lot. And I have found that it's either that I've met ones who really just almost languished in their money. They bought stuff all the time, they were big spenders, or else they're like really frugal and they hardly spend, and they're constantly pursuing money. And if you ask them, well, how much are you trying to get to? They'll be like, oh, $1 million. But once I get to $1 million, I'll set a new goal. They're never actually satisfied. It's never actually enough money. Like a poor person like me, when I was a kid, I was like, once I earn enough to cover my bills, I'm gonna have it made. But that's not how they think. The majority of the time, they do not view, oh, I need enough money to create a good life for myself, and then I don't need more money after that. They're still in the pursuit. And part of it, as far as I can tell, is that they're human. And there are studies on this, there are some statistics on this, but a lot of multimillionaires, and some of them will flat out tell you, they're multimillionaires because they feel insecure, or they feel worthless. They feel like they constantly have to prove that they're good enough, and they need a tangible, physical thing that they can see, a number that's getting bigger and bigger, to reinforce to themselves as evidence, as actual evidence, okay, I'm not a piece of crap, and I'm capable of doing something right. They use over-functioning as a coping method. And because they use overfunctioning as a coping method, it's more socially acceptable. People who use consumption as a coping method, or people who just flat out start falling apart and get depressed, and they're just trying to create a safer environment for themselves by closing off that they can tolerate. It's not socially as acceptable as overfunctioning. So you'll see stuff like Elon Musk is an overfunctioner. He works all the time, and he doesn't want to hire anyone who isn't willing to work at least 50 hours a week. Because their personal experience is, this is the coping method that actually is beneficial. This is what needs to happen. I've met, unfortunately, too many millionaires who think it's really important for everyone else to be just like them, and that if you're not, you're lazy, or you're an underachiever, or you're not ambitious enough. Having a fulfilling and balanced and sustainable life is not the goal for the majority of millionaires and multimillionaires that I've met. And again, I've encountered 21, 22 in my life. And almost none of them were worth $1 million. Almost all of them were worth more than $1 million. It's interesting, the ones that kind of just squander the money and stuff, they almost actually have more of like a gambling thing going on, or a hoarding thing going on. And their coping method, they just happen to be able to have enough money to feed it. And I've seen a ton of poor people who have the exact same issues, and they have the exact same coping methods. And it's just less socially acceptable because they're poor. In reality, that they're human. They're very, very human. They're normal people in that they have emotional pain and insecurities, and they are motivated by that. They are propelled to do certain things and behaviors by those emotional feelings and those needs. I've met some multimillionaires before who believed that they had to practically hide that they had money, and that they didn't trust people, and that they had to live as frugal as possible and keep every single penny like nitpicked and stuff. And they owned a chain of gas stations, and they were like constantly like competitive with the gas station across the street. Oh, they raised their price by this. Well, haha, in your face. My price just went down 3 cents. I'll have more of your customers. You know, like, they get so aggressive, and it shows in the way they manage their money. They're so aggressive in the way they manage their money because they're constantly trying to control everything because they feel so completely insecure. I've seen other ones who feel so completely insecure that they constantly have to present themselves it by a certain standard, and everyone be impressed with them at all times. And if you don't act like they're, you know, the most magnificent thing in the world, they don't want you around. I've seen before multimillionaires be really oblivious to quote-unquote real life. I've met like 3 out of the ones that I have met who were pretty aware of A, that they were really lucky and that most people didn't live like them, and B, that they didn't want to add to that problem, that they didn't want to make people feel crappy about themselves, that they didn't have that expectation that other people be like them, and that if they weren't, they were less than, or something like that. But the majority of multimillionaires that I have met, unfortunately, are not that way. And I've unfortunately met a lot that genuinely think poor people are that way because they just don't want enough, or they just don't try hard enough, or they just don't do enough, and they're just not putting in the effort or whatever. Like, I've met a bunch of them that are very aggressively that way. I've had a girlfriend whose parents were insanely wealthy, and they hated me. And the reason they hated me was because I was poor. It didn't matter that I gave my girlfriend, you know, their daughter, everything she wanted in a relationship. Money was not one of the things she wanted. She was completely capable. She earned she had a 6-figure job. Money was something she was totally capable of giving herself. She did not need that from a partner. What she had was super authoritarian parents, and she needed a partner who was very emotionally supportive, who was not critical or, you know, constantly criticizing her the way that her parents did when she was growing up. She needed a partner who would take care of little things, or that she could focus on taking care of big things. She didn't like doing things like household chores, for instance. And me, I don't mind doing household chores. So, you know, it worked out. And she also needed someone who would like treat her in a loving way that was unconditional, and tell her all the time how beautiful she was, because her dad constantly was like, have you exercised recently? You know, and like tell her how capable she was, because her mom was constantly like, oh, should I come rescue you? Do you need me to fly there? Like, you know, just constantly harping on her. And she needed someone who was supportive in her life. Her parents despised me simply because I was poor. And they lived in a mansion, they had all this wealth, and they thought for sure that the only reason I was with her was hoping that they would die and leave an inheritance to her, and that I would get some. They were convinced that that was it. That's the reason I was with her. And it couldn't possibly be that I actually cared about her. It couldn't possibly be that she was actually important or, you know, meaningful in my life, and that I got something out of the relationship that had something other to do than with money. They could not fathom that. They thought I was trying to work my way up the system without actually having to work. And they found that highly offensive. I have met a lot of multimillionaires who are that way. I remember, for instance, again, the guy my dad worked for, he had 2 sons, and they were very concerned about who the sons would date. They were so concerned. And the boys were a little older than I was, you know, and they had like their own house. They literally had a giant mansion, but then they had a second house for the 2 sons, so that the sons could have their own space. And they were like teenagers. They were like 13 and 14. Like, They had their own ATVs, they had their own... Anyway, that's all besides the point. The point is, they were very concerned about if the boys developed a crush on a girl, like, well, what's her education like? What college is she probably going to get into? Like, how likely is it that she's going to make her own money? Make sure you understand that you need to talk to her about a prenup. They're teenagers. And they need to talk to a girl about a prenup. Like, they're very, very stingy. They're very like, everything that I have is mine. No one else can have any of it. They're very, I worked hard to get this, so no one else can touch it. They're very territorial. Territorial. Stingy is the wrong word. Territorial is more right. Because everything that they've earned, they don't actually need all that money to live, to have a quality of life. They live on a fraction of it. They probably, oh my gosh, I don't even know how much they spent, but if I had to estimate, it's probably only 10 mil for all their years. If they have 100 mil and they're making, you know, tens of mils a year, they're spending like maybe a third on their actual living of what they're earning. And then the rest of it is all just hoarding. But they can't let go of the money because the money is defining that they're worth something. The money is therapy for them. Instead of going to a therapist and actually working through their personal issues, they're desperate to hold on to the mountain of money that they have created because it's the hill that they can die on. It's the hill that they can build a shining beacon on top of, and everyone can see that they're worth something. And they're so desperate to be worth something. And I talked to one of them about it quite openly because he was willing to talk about it openly. And he was very, very open about the fact that it was about his father. And his father wasn't even alive anymore. And yet he was still driven to prove to this dead man that he was worth something. And he was like, yeah, my father, he told me what I couldn't be. He told me what I couldn't do, you know, and he had all these expectations. I would do it his way or no way. And if I did it his way, then I wouldn't be a loser. But if I went off on my own and started my own business, I would be a loser. And I went and started my own business, and I showed him, and I'm still showing him. And this guy was old enough he could retire comfortably, easily. He had, I think it was over 200 mil. Like, not net worth, not fake assets, but actually like money invested, money he could turn into liquid money if he wanted to and have fluid access to. And he still was completely compelled to keep growing that number, even though he couldn't take any of it with him when he died, even though his father was dead. Even though he recognized that the reason he was doing this, he had lived with himself long enough for enough decades that he recognized why he was this way. But he felt like he couldn't change it, and did he necessarily want to? This made him successful. And since he was successful, why would he change? And it had nothing to do with overall happiness or satisfaction with life. He was completely not content with his life, even though he had over 200 mil. The goal isn't fulfillment for most of the multimillionaires that I have seen. And interestingly, a lot of the poor people I've been around, because I grew up in poverty, that's not the goal for them either. A lot of the poor people that I've met have like these big numbers that they want to get to. They daydream, they spend hours thinking about getting to this money. And they aren't getting to the money necessarily just to, oh, I would finally be able to get a house. Like, that's awesome, that's great, but it doesn't stop there. It's not just, I want to provide for my family, I want to have housing security, I want to be able to put food on the table. It's so much more than that. Oh, I'll buy all the things I could never buy. Oh, all those kids, they used to tease me constantly about my shoes. Well, I'll have a wall of high-end sneakers. None of them will be worth less than $500. And I'll have, you know, these 8 cars. And it's all excessive. It's all the exact same concept, except they don't have the money to back it. The multimillionaire often is super lucky, or they're just so driven that they're like so over-functioning that it's like a frenzy. And they just can't stop. They're like addicted to continuing to be hyper-focused on tasks. They're so task-orientated. And the poor person, they're like trying all these different avenues and none of them are working yet, but they're still trying because one day they're going to get lucky too, and it's going to work, and then they're going to have all the money and they're going to do all the stuff. And I see that so much, like people using money and the idea of money and the pursuit of money as a coping method for emotional pain, for traumatic childhoods, for feeling insecure or anxious, for feeling like desperate. Desperation is definitely a big one. And they feel a compulsion. And so I really, from my perspective, have seen a lot in multimillionaires that is essentially lauding the negative side of our emotional struggles. That is reinforcing the negative side of our emotional struggles as people. What we actually will be fulfilled by is a healthy life, a balanced life, a life where we have some safety and security, we have some provision, but we're not over-consuming. And instead, we're establishing good things in the world, and we are doing things that are beneficial. And instead, there's an obsession with consume, get the number bigger. And it's not just the rich who have that, it's just that the rich are enabled. Enabling negative behavior isn't healthy. It doesn't matter if you're poor or you're rich. As far as I can tell, the reason that some of the negative greed stuff happens with the multimillionaires is because they're just as human as the people who aren't multimillionaires. They're just as human. It's just that they have the resources and the power, the authority to do negative things and get away with it. There's no barrier for that. There's less repercussion. The poor person can't afford the fine. The rich person can. The poor person can't afford to risk losing their house. The rich person can. The poor person can't afford to throw everything into one single investment and hope that it works, let alone diversify investments. And the rich person can. The rich person can afford to gamble. The rich person can afford to overconsume. The rich person can afford to hoard. They can afford to perpetuate overfunctioning and negative behaviors, and they treat it, sometimes they're so unaware, they're so oblivious to the reality of things that they'll even treat it like it's a good thing. I mean, how many people jump on hustle culture? The goal isn't at all that you want to have as many jobs going as possible. The reason we have so many jobs going is so that we can afford ourselves, because everything's so freaking expensive. But in actuality, the goal was to have one job and be able to afford all the things that you need to live. And we're so far away from that that now it's like, well, are you even really trying if you have one job? There used to be people who could afford to live on a part-time job years and years and years ago. Now, if you have only one full-time job, you're broke and you can't afford your bills and you're in the red. That's not a good thing. That's not a healthy thing. That's not a balanced thing. Like, from a psychological standard, that is a damaging thing. But that's the standard we've settled for. When I've been around multimillionaires in my life, the biggest takeaway I've had from it is that they're human, is that they're people. I can listen to them brag about how they don't pay taxes. I can listen to them talk about the loopholes that they find, and I can see, like, me playing a video game and looking for ways to level up and looking for, oh, I found this secret treasure or this secret cave. I can see the multimillionaire talking about going to this spa or whatever, and that while they're there, they're also going to check their emails on their phone and stuff, and they view that as work. And I can see, you know, the exact same thing in a person who's sitting watching TV with, like, Netflix or something, and also doing surveys on their phone. Like, I can see the human. And sometimes with a multimillionaire, all you see is the millions. All you see is the money. The big giant pile of net worth and assets and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And in reality, that's so fake. It's like a delusion. In reality, they're just a person. If there's anything I've taken away from my time being around multimillionaires, is that they're just a person. And that almost all of them really need therapy. Like, badly. Some of them actually go to therapy. That's becoming more acceptable. And I'm glad. I think that that should become more acceptable across the board for poor, rich, anything. It should be far more acceptable to do personal work on yourself, deal with the fact that you are not just a physical person, but you are an emotional and mental person as well. That there is more to you than just the physical body that's walking around. And that we, working on ourselves internally and like going to therapy is like going to the gym. You're getting a workout. You're getting a mental and emotional workout. It's the same thing with learning. I highly encourage learning something new constantly. Be learning something. Exposing yourself to new things and understandings, because it's mentally developing you. Every time you watch a YouTube video or listen to a podcast or read a vlog or do a course or whatever it is, if you're learning something and you're putting it into practice, you're mentally stimulating yourself. And we are more than just physical as people. Being over obsessed with the physical material stuff, with the money number, with the way we present physically to other people, it's just unhealthy. Outright. It's not a healthy coping mechanism. And the enabling of doing that is just, honestly, it's sad. I have, even when I was a child, I felt a lot of pity for some of the multimillionaires that I was around. They had horrible marriages. Some of them had great marriages, but some of them had horrible marriages, but they didn't feel like they could get divorced because she was going to take half. And so they just stayed in a miserable marriage. Like there was a guy who literally eventually got divorced, and she did. She took half, and like it almost ruined him. He almost couldn't afford it because he still had to invest into his business. He really was broken about it. And it wasn't just the money. It was also, he was broken about that he had been wrong with who he chose. He thought he was in love when he first married her. He thought this is the good plan, and the emotional hit of losing someone that you love is a big hit. And even if you've been having a horrible marriage for years and arguing for years, it's still painful, and it still feels like failure. And of course, feeling like failure reinforces the insecurity about being not good enough, and it all just perpetuates itself. And he went on to be so hyper obsessed with money that he's way past retirement age and he's still working, because money was the one thing that he could have that was a tangible thing that made him feel less like a failure. Don't think he's ever done a single day of therapy. It's just sad to me. It's really, really sad to me. I can have compassion for the plight of the bottom 50% of Americans who are struggling and who are poor and who are hungry, who are in a constant pressure cooker of bills, bills, bills. Like, I can have so much compassion for that and recognize that that's me. That's been my life, you know, and still have compassion for a person who doesn't have that kind of stress and instead is just wallowing in a non-stop, desperate attempt at distracting themselves from a whole other kind of stress that they just can't get away from. It haunts them. Every day they wake up haunted by it. I can have compassion for that. It's really, really sad. A lot of multimillionaires have some really good things in their life that I can personally think I would like to have something in my life similar, or I can admit I'd be envious of that. And then there's some things about it that I'm like, well, at least I'm not like that. I feel like maybe they could be a little envious of me sometimes. We're all just people. In reality, we're human.